Well, you got to follow up a big win against the LA Kings with another win against the Calgary Flames. But the Jets can't rest on their laurels, and we'll talk about how they can achieve victory on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we're taking a bit of a pause. The Jets have off until Thursday, and the team is probably feeling pretty good after a big win against the Kings. A lot that went well in a game that, you look at the scoreline and you might think it was relatively close, and there were moments where it was. But generally speaking, in the most critical moments, the Jets were better. And that is really what counts, especially with the new look lineup and how the Jets actually arranged things and made some really good improvements that hopefully carry on in the future. But, they can't quite settle down yet. They actually have a big game against the Calgary Flames coming up. And I wouldn't say it's against a team that's doing particularly well. The Flames are, for lack of a better word, pretty crappy. We'll talk about what's going on with that team and how their recent record looks. But before we get into what the Jets can do to beat them as well, just wanted to let you know tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, circling back to the Calgary Flames, like I said, they are not doing super hot recently. They have only won like 2 games in their last 8, which is pretty rough. Actually, 2 or 3 games in their last 8. I'm actually counting tonight as they're currently in game. They're just starting off in the third period against the Anaheim Ducks. They are down 3-2, but you look at a lot of their losses recently, and things are looking pretty grim. They did beat the Kings, so I'm sure they're happy about that. But sandwiching all of this is a healthy dose of defeats to the Blues, the Blackhawks, the Sabres, the Canucks, and the Caps. 5 losses preceding that win against the Kings, and in some of these games, they were getting smoked pretty badly. From folks who have watched this team recently, the general vibe I get is that they are just basically waiting for the season to end. You have some really bad losses, including a 7-2 demolition by the Canes a few weeks ago. They lost 5-2 to the Caps. They lost 4-2 to Vancouver, one of their arch rivals, 4-1 to Buffalo. You see a lot of offense from the opponents and not a lot of scoring from the Flames. So Calgary, they've struggled to not only generate goals, but stop conceding them. And for the Jets, this is an ideal opportunity to take on a team that is frankly reeling. And, this is, I think, a good test for the Jets to stay focused and also kind of work on some of the chemistry and communication. You noticed in the last game that, given the deep pairing shuffling and stuff, there were moments where not only the defenders, but also the forwards weren't always on the same page. A lot of these combos haven't played together all that much. And one of those lines we didn't even expect because Toffoli, was out last second. So I would say for this game against the Flames, this will be hopefully a relatively straightforward assignment. The Jets should be able to get through Calgary, and I think it's really important for Winnipeg to come away with a win because after this, they have a really hard road trip through almost the entirety of the core of the Central and some of the teams that they are really jockeying for position with in the playoff run. And what is going to be interesting is you're going to see games against Dallas and Colorado, which are really going to be litmus tests for what this new lineup is like, especially if Bones sticks to it. Now, I do have some questions about whether or not he's actually going to keep these lines together, and I think the biggest one that I have is where Cole-Perfetti plays, because my guess is that he's not going to stick with the second line. I have a feeling that that's going to change, and I feel like that'd be really unfortunate because I thought, what Perfetti does well and what has always stuck out about him is that he's a super crafty player, very smart decision maker, and oftentimes he understands how to perhaps compensate for weaknesses of his line mates, but in return, they also help him with some of his scoring droughts, right? You see that the interlocking play and good passing and stuff that he had with Connor, I thought really did a good job of making the most of both of their skill sets. There were moments where Perfetti wasn't always in the best position to score, and Connor found him perhaps at a better area. And then, if Connor had a turnover or something, Perfetti was right back there offering defensive support, trying to force turnovers, and working along the walls. So a lot of different things where these guys kind of work well off of each other. And I think that's a duo I'd actually like to see continue. Honestly, I don't even know if it matters who the center is. I think Monahan's a nice fit so far because he's just a very good player to have when you're looking for somebody who can be, good enough to keep up, even if they're maybe not the most high-end elite attacker. You're looking for a guy who can still hang with the big boys, and Monahan has done a good job of that. Now, is he having a great season? I wouldn't say yes in the sense that he's really driving play or anything, but I think for what Winnipeg needed, they were looking for a guy who could anchor their middle six center roles, whether it was on the second or third line, and I think he's done a really good job of that. He's also been a really nice boost on the power play, and one thing that also really sticks out is that he does a great job parking his butt in front of the net and tipping some decent shots. So good to see that. I think, in a lot of areas, that trio has some real potential to be a menace come the postseason. But the biggest question is, will Bones keep them together? And, I do have my suspicions about that. I think for, how Bones often approaches his philosophy and how he changes the lineup according to that, I feel like he's going to put Toffoli back up there, which, like Connor-Monahan-Perfetti, that's not a bad line at all. I don't know if it's going to work as well as Perfetti did there because Toffoli is less of a two-way wonderkind and more of a guy who's like a pure shooter, which when you have two pure shooters sandwiched around Monahan, I kind of wonder how that's going to pan out. The other thing is that line is going to have some foot speed issues, which we saw even with Ehlers, right? Nick was actually, in my mind, a little too fast for how Monahan and Toffoli played, but you had Perfetti now with Monahan and Connor, and I feel like the deliberate pacing on top of Perfetti actually being a little bit faster than I think people realize, and the way that he positions himself to anticipate plays and make good heads-up reads, I think it makes him faster in more than just foot speed. He's just a better all-around player and more creative guy, and he kind of works around his own mobility issues. So Toffoli, I think, is a very similar player, but he's perhaps a step slower in that regard. So for me, Perfetti really should stay with that trio. I think it has the potential to do really big damage. And I would say for this game, I'm expecting a big performance from the top line. You saw flashes of it in, brief spurts. But if you have Scheifele, Ehlers, and Velarde again together, based on how some of their late shifts against the Kings went and some of the earlier shifts once they had their first couple of bobbled pucks and turnovers pushed to the side, I thought they looked really fun. And I think that they'll have a good time getting some chemistry back together against Calgary, which should be, again, a softer opponent, a nicer way to kind of glide into what's going to be a tough road game set, against the Central next week. But for the Jets, this is a team that they probably shouldn't sleep on. The Flames have always played them close, and I wouldn't expect anything too different in this one. So we will see how the Jets do in this one. I'm hoping for a big win. I'm hoping for continued performances and top-end players really stepping up and showing what they're made of, but we'll see. Maybe Winnipeg surprises us with a bad game and suddenly the lineup gets blown up again, but I'm hoping that we maybe have gotten past that stage. We'll see. But obviously, I just mentioned Toffoli, and I want to talk about some ideas I had for how to put him back in the lineup, especially because the Jets might have some line combos that they can sort of experiment with, and they do still have a few games to test whether or not those ideas are really going to work. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Game Time. For those of you who are, used to buying tickets and stuff, you all know how much it sucks when you get hit with surprise fees, lots of extra charges, and, it might be one of those situations where you buy a seat and you're honestly not sure what the view is like. You have to take a guess based on a weird seating map that's two-dimensional, and guess what? That ain't going to tell you what your view is. Game Time is here to help with all-in prices, views from your seat when available, and their lowest price guarantee. They want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, and they are now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which for a lot of you is probably super exciting news. I'm, an Orioles fan, so I plan to head on down to Camden Yards a number of times. Maybe you'll be heading out to the Jays field for a couple of games over the next few months. I don't know how many of you are even close to Toronto, but even if you're not and you're still interested in maybe taking a trip out there, might be worth it. And Game Time will help you pick some great ticket options because they also offer last minute sales, flash deals, and you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for not only Jays games, but concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're interested in. They want to help you save money and time. And we also have a really cool offer for those of you who are listeners of the Locked On Podcast Network. We want you to take the guesswork out of buying tickets and go with Game Time because you can download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just talking about some stuff ahead of Winnipeg's game against the Calgary Flames. I would say it's a draft game, but I'm hoping that after how the Jets played against the LA Kings, we are sort of past that phase for now. I think this was a good opportunity for the Jets to build on some positive things, some positive tactical developments, and good vibes. And hopefully they continue that against the Flames team that really has been tanking its way towards the bottom of the Pacific Division. Before we talk about what the Jets should do with Tyler Toffoli, though, just wanted to let you know something really cool the Locked On Network is doing. If you're a Fox Sports or ESPN watcher or listener, if you're always finding yourself having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting and constant yelling, maybe you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the shouting and screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the Amazon Fire TV channels app. And again, it is Locked On Sports Today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Tyler Toffoli, really talented player, but he's one of those guys where you sort of have to know what he's good at and what he'll struggle with. And generally speaking, Toffoli is your volume shooter and creator down low. But when it comes to, his obvious weaknesses, foot speed is kind of an issue. He's not going to be the guy that's like a crazy back-checking presence. So you're not really asking him to do a lot of defensive work until he's back in his own end, which it will take him a minute to get there. It'll also take him a minute to get up the ice, but he's generally pretty good in transitions. So factoring all of that in, I thought it might make a lot of sense to try him with Niederreiter and Lowry. Now, Niederreiter does actually sound like he might miss some time. It's really hard to say. A slash, like a skate cut of some sort, perhaps. It sounded like that was the case, and what happened to the back of his leg. He stumbled and fell in the tunnel, which was caught on cameras, but obviously his diagnosis was a little bit unclear. We just heard that he had stitches, and that was sort of the extent of it. But given how severe leg injuries like that can be, I would think he might miss a couple of games at least. Maybe we're lucky and he only misses one or two, but yeah, stitches to the back of your leg are a little bit different than your face. I feel like the leg is a little bit more tender, and given how much of that, is where you're generating a lot of your locomotion and stuff for skating and, having that agility and stuff, anything that risks not only re-injuring and tearing that wound open, but also impeding the ability for your muscles to work properly really doesn't feel like something that's worth risking. I don't know how deep the cut was. I'd prefer not to know, to be honest, because it sounded pretty awful. And given the fact that Niederreiter actually fell in the tunnel, it had to have hurt really badly. So just hoping for a quick recovery for him. In his stead, I could imagine Toffoli sliding in there, pretty nicely. Toffoli's a little bit different than what Niederreiter usually does. Tyler is kind of a longer distance shooter, and I think his release tends to be really underrated. He's a bit of a sniper. He's got those quick releases, almost from like a dead standstill whereas Niederreiter is the kind who's going to crash the net and try for greasy rebounds and tap-ins. Not that he doesn't have some fine releases and, some really good deflections, but generally speaking, he has kind of fit the role of being a really good forechecker and somebody who's not afraid to attack the goal mouth area, where Toffoli is a little bit different. I think Tyler might be able to get some good scoring opportunities from closer to the face-off circles, maybe pick some corners, and give Lowry and Appleton a little bit more finishing ability. I think that has been something that this line has struggled with. The finishing for this trio, unfortunately, ranks near the bottom amongst lines that do this while creating chances. This trio generally dominates, 5v5 play and outcreates opponents by a good margin, but the problem is, amongst all of the lines that do this kind of work, this trio has one of the lowest finishing rates in the whole league. They, and it's something you can actually watch. You can see that these guys don't exactly have, an elite release. They might hit posts more often. They don't exactly have an overwhelming shot that's going to fool goalies or have the sort of deception and stick handling that's going to really dazzle people. Appleton has shown flashes once in a while, but I think you sort of know what you're getting with him, which is like a modest 30-point player and a guy who's generally going to be more on the two-way side of things than he is an outright scorer. Lowry is kind of in the same vein. I think, a lot of people make fun of his stone hands. He's a great third-line center, but I do think, a lot of his expertise comes more on the defensive side of things. But where he does perhaps have a bit of an underrated reputation is with his passing. I think he's really good at it. I think that he has some great vision and spatial awareness, especially below the goal line, and Toffoli might be a good player who can take advantage of that. So if that trio works together, I definitely wouldn't mind it. I also wouldn't mind maybe turning your fourth line into like another middle six line. If you have Barron, Nemesnikov, and Toffoli together, I think that would be a delicious trio. I think it'd be very potent. And I think with how Nemesnikov has been this year, which is a guy who's been as good as a second line center and somebody who can basically play anywhere you want him to, other than like the first line with Connor and Scheifele, he can do almost anything else, and he's generally been good at almost all of it. Maybe not a world beater, but you don't need him to be. You need him to be really competent, a guy who can be a floor raiser, and I think he has done all of that, adding, a lot of good versatility without sacrificing some of the defensive work and forechecking that Bones is going to ask for. Now, I gave you those line combos, but I don't think Bones is actually going to go with them. I suspect we're going to see Connor, Monahan, and Toffoli again, which I just talked about as being a good trio. I don't know if it's going to be the best, and I kind of wonder if Perfetti really would be the safer option here. Maybe, though, maybe for once Bones surprises us and opts to trust his short-term vision, because with coaching decisions, it's often really hard. You don't have a lot of samples to work with. You have to assess if line is gelling, but in my mind, if you saw how they cooked against LA, it'd be really hard to come up with an argument to disband Connor, Monahan, and Perfetti. That trio was dynamite. I really feel like that could give the Jets one of the best 1-2 punches in the league. And, it'd be crazy to really walk away from that when they had a massive 3-point night for a lot of those guys. And I would just, I would like to give it a little more time. If it doesn't work in the following games, okay, cool. Shuffle the deck and go back to some combos that you feel a little more comfortable with. But give this trio time. They already hit it off so quickly, almost by accident. I mean, they weren't expecting to play together, but they looked phenomenal. So maybe this is a time where you can have a little bit more patience. Of course, I did mention that the Jets do have some time to sort this sort of stuff out and, find a couple of line combos, but they are running out of time, and I wanted to talk briefly about how the playoff picture is looking because it continues to change minute by minute. It's still in flux right now, and there's a lot that's happening, and I think it's probably one of the more exciting playoff pictures because it's very unpredictable, and we also have some really weird storylines with some of the teams that are in current playoff spots, and we'll get to that and talk about some of those big ones in just a moment. Before we go too much further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the March Madness tournament. A lot of you have probably been following along with college basketball, both on the men's and women's side. I think the men's side has generally been pretty disappointing. Not that I know that much about basketball, but I feel like a lot of the seeds this year I heard talked about were generally sort of frowned upon. I think a lot of the rankings and the subsequent playoff committees made bad decisions, it sounds like, and that definitely threw off some brackets, but it sounds like the women's competition has just been an absolute blast to watch, and a ton of action, a ton of chaos. Sounds like it's been a great time, and if you're following along and you want to make some easy cash off of it, this might be a great chance for you to bet on the big upset of a 1 seed or find that extra bona fide gem that you think nobody else is paying attention to. Whether you're betting on that upset or a 1 seed, though, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines, maybe some fun player stats, whatever you're interested in, maybe even who's going to win all of the tournaments. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops right now until they cut down the nets. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just closing out with a quick look at the current playoff bracket for the East and West. Obviously, this is subject to change, and based on how some of these teams continue to sit on the fringes and margins, and seemingly, especially for the wildcard teams, can't really solidify their form enough to, lock it in this spot. I think it's a little early to be talking about which matchups we're going to see, but, there's a lot of jockeying and there's a lot of fun things to consider. One of the interesting ones out in the East, if you can even call this interesting, it's Boston versus Washington. And I think what makes this opening round very fun is that the Caps have one of the worst goal differentials of any playoff team. I think they actually have the worst because the Flyers are the only other team in the negative. And like the Caps have conceded like tons more, like almost like 15 to 20 goals more than the Flyers have. Washington, last I saw, was a -35, which I think would be one of the worst goal differentials of a playoff team in recent history. I can't remember the last time we ever saw something like this, but the Caps are seemingly getting enough saves from Lindgren in some of their wins and scoring enough in those games to decide those close margins. But then when they lose, they have gotten thrashed. They just got obliterated tonight, like 5-2 or 6-2 or something like that against the Sabres. So I don't really know what to make of them. I think they're bad. I think they're a little bit chaotic, but they have the makings of a team that could really stump somebody somehow in the first round and maybe find their way into the second. The next matchup you've got is the Panthers versus the Leafs, and I think this is just a really good high-end matchup between a team that has perhaps disappointed a lot of folks. I think it's underperformed, and you know which one I'm talking about. It's Toronto. They haven't really been able to get things going this season at a level that I think most people would expect for a franchise of this caliber and the stars that they have. But Matthews is like scoring 1 billion goals this year, seemingly without slowing down, and this Leafs offense is still pretty potent, but the Panthers are defensively pretty sound. They've had a really good year from Bobrovsky, and with their offense being so lethal, especially on the power play, I think that's a very fun matchup where, it could come down to a Game 7. Given that, you might look at Hurricanes and Flyers and think that's not all that exciting. The Flyers did just sign a new goalie recently, a young prospect who I can't imagine he'll really come into the lineup too much in these final games, but maybe they intend to make him a bigger part of this and spell Ersson a little bit because Ersson's been playing a lot. But against the Hurricanes, it's hard to imagine Philadelphia coming out of this series. I know the Canes are traditionally one of those teams in the playoffs that everyone says chokes, but I got to say, I think this time they'll be confident against a Flyers team that's mostly just mediocre. I think the Flyers are not terrible, but I can't really see them going all that far. And Tortorella having some issues with guys like Couturier really can't be great vibes heading into the postseason. Last current matchup you've got is Rangers versus Lightning. This feels pretty lopsided. The Lightning are a team, though, that somehow I just have some concerns about because I feel like they have upset potential, and the Rangers at this point, they're going all in. They're looking for the cup win, and they've had a pretty dominant run this year, sitting at the top of the Metro. There's really been no competition there. It'll be interesting to see if they can survive Tampa Bay. The Lightning are one of those teams that's really reliant on the power play, but maybe they somehow put 2 and 2 together in the postseason and look a little more dangerous at 5v5. Hard to bet against them, but I think the Rangers are probably one of those teams that you feel pretty confident beating them. Out in the West, it's a lot of toss-up sort of stuff. You've got Canucks and Kings in the first round, which, the Canucks have slowly started to wind down that whole PDO bender they've been on. And, it can never last for too much longer, but you did think it might last the whole season. Well, second half of the season's been a little bit rough. They're currently losing to Vegas right now pretty badly, and it was only like the second period. And it's been following a pattern recently where they've struggled to score a little more frequently. So maybe LA surprises them, because I thought the Kings looked pretty dangerous in the game against the Jets when they weren't getting outplayed. So some interesting food for thought. I still think Canucks should come through on that one, but maybe something really weird happens. Avs and Jets could be a real toss-up. I still think Colorado has the clear edge on paper, but maybe the Jets can find a way to get through with some good top six play and Hellebuck being Hellebuck. If you can make that matchup against McKinnon come out with as little damage as possible and maybe beat up on the Avs' depth, that might be Winnipeg's key to winning. That's if they play the Avs. Again, like I said, there's been a lot of changeover with the top three of the Central, and all of these teams are within like mere points of each other. So yeah, it's going to be a close one, but currently, if I had to choose, the Avs might be one of the teams that I could see the Jets perhaps getting through. And that's, relatively speaking. Oilers and Golden Knights will be the current matchup coming out of the Pacific, which should be a blast. You have two high-octane offenses with fast counters, lots of loose hockey, some questionable goaltending recently. It should make for an absolute thriller. And with McDavid being McDavid and Draisaitl offering a good supporting cast against a phenomenal and really well-coached Knights team that, while mediocre this year, is still super dangerous. Yeah, it could be a really fun one. And Tomas Hertl coming back recently, it might be a bit of a different series than what people are expecting. Final matchup could be Stars and Preds, and that's probably more beneficial to the Jets. The Preds beating up on Dallas before Dallas gets to the second round, if they do get to the second round, would be really beneficial, because the Jets will probably have had their hands full trying to take on Colorado. And if Winnipeg comes out of that, might be a pretty good time then to take on a team like, say, a more worn down Preds or Star squad. I have to imagine that Nashville's run of form is going to slow down at some point. Maybe it doesn't, but you have to think that whole crazy run that they're on is going to hit something of a snag at some point. And the Stars are super deep. They're very scary. They're definitely the clear favorite in that series, but with how the Preds have been, hard to really bet on them right now. Maybe something crazy happens and the Jets can relive a round two matchup against the Preds like they did in their glory years a couple of seasons ago. I know I personally would think that'd be a ton of fun, even if the Jets maybe aren't as good as they were back then. But lots of food for thought. Let me know which playoff matchups you might be paying the most attention to. Who do you think of these teams are actually going to still be in their current playoff spots? Which matchups, hypothetically, are you the most excited about? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here later this week. I have to figure out my recording schedule just because I'll be on the road a bit for some work stuff, but hoping we'll have another episode tomorrow, and we'll see what comes out of it. Maybe some good standings updates, maybe a check-in on some of the big award season stuff, because if you look at some of the goal-scoring races this year, it's been pretty crazy, if I'm being honest, but you'll have to stay tuned to hear about who might be favorites for those for a future episode. But like I said, for tonight's show, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here later, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.